Today's lecture, of course, I'll be talking about, the end of the war, World War II. I'll kind of go into, how the Allies win the war, because around 1942, 43, the Allies start defeating the Axis powers, and that kind of leads to eventually the Allies defeating them in the war. We'll get to that. Of course, it later leads into the Cold War era afterwards. So anyway, from last time, I think we had talked about how the United States had gotten in the war. That was kind of a turning point in the war, I think, when that happened. And I think we also talked about how Soviet Union got invaded by, of course, Nazi Germany. So really another turning point right there, likely later. But of course, today I'm going to get into discussing, I'll get into some of the major events that'll happen. Of course, I'll talk about Case Blue, how that doesn't go very well. We'll talk about Stalingrad a little later because that's kind of a major turning point in the war. Also, the North African campaign with Erwin Rommel. We'll get to that as well and talk about that. But first, want to go ahead and talk about, the main things that happened like in 1942. 1942, there were numerous turning point battles that were in the war where the Allies won. Eventually World War II. The three big ones they always talk about were battles of El Alamein, which happened, or really two of them. There was one in July of 1942, and then the one that's more important is the second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. Of course, the Battle of Stalingrad, which of course I'll mention later a little bit about too. It's really the most pivotal battle. I think they consider that one to be the main turning point really of the war. So that's one of them right there. And then, of course, the other one is the Battle of Midway in the Pacific, United States fighting Imperial Japan, and all that. That's considered a big turning point. I think the other ones are like D-Day, and I want to say development of the Manhattan Project with the atomic bomb. Those are some other major, turning points really in World War II. Now, I want to go ahead and talk about, of course, the North African campaign here, which you see. The North African campaign is really considered to be one of the major events, really, that I think is considered one of the first turning points, really, of the war. It pitted really two different sides in the war. The North African, part of what was fought was Hitler was trying to seize control of all of North Africa, especially Egypt. One of the main things they wanted, because Egypt's got the Suez Canal. You've got like access to some of the oil fields in the east and all that. Another reason why it happened was the German forces were also sent into North Africa to try to reinforce Mussolini, who was in Libya at the time, because they had suffered defeats against the British in 1940. So that was another reason for why, of course, this happened. And so Hitler sent one of his top generals, if you know about this, Erwin Rommel, to North Africa. And Rommel created this German-Italian army, which was known as the Afrika Korps. Spelled correctly the way it is, it's the German variation of the name. It was a German-Italian mechanized army, using like mostly tanks and mechanized trucks and things like that. Rommel, of course, got a name for himself in the war, if you know. They called him the Desert Fox because he was great at, fighting desert warfare and all that. But a lot was hopeless in the war. I think the Germans really didn't have enough forces really in North Africa to really tip the balance, or enough war equipment as well, because most of their forces were having to fight on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. So the second Battle of El Alamein is very, very pivotal battle, of course, in the war. Rommel's forces would fight against Bernard Montgomery, who was eventually brought in as the main general. It was head of the 8th Army, the British 8th Army, which was based in Egypt. They called him Monty, or you can see they sometimes called him the Spartan General. It's not one of the top generals on the British side of the war, but a lot of people consider it to be one of the best generals that the British had in the war. He fought pretty much in North Africa, Sicily, later also in Europe in World War II. But Second Battle of Alamein was a battle that was fought really between October 23rd to November 11th, 1942. Why was it an important battle? Well, if you go to this map here that I've got, you can see that they were fighting over El Alamein. El Alamein was this important. It was like a rail junction that was right there in Port City. That's on the Mediterranean coast. And if the Germans could have taken that, they could have then marched southward and taken Cairo, and then obviously the British would have had to evacuate Egypt. And then Hitler probably could have seized the Suez Canal, which that would have been kind of a turning point in the war and all that. However, the British were reinforced with a lot of war equipment from the United States, like tanks and stuff, like through the Lend-Lease Act that was passed in the United States. That also helped out the Soviets and the Chinese in the war. And what happened in the battle was that the German forces were actually routed. You can see how they launched their attack into into Libya right there, and pushed the Germans back. And the Germans were routed. They got beat pretty bad. I think they consider El Alamein to be really one of the only major British battles in the war that was pretty decisive. And Rommel's forces, they lost like half his army at El Alamein. He did. I think like something like 40,000 were killed, wounded, or captured by the British side. He lost the majority of his tanks. I think he lost like something like 500 tanks in the battle, like almost just about all of them. And so El Alamein was pretty important. From there, what happened was Rommel was then pushed basically westward through Libya. He's going to lose Libya too. He'll be pushed back into like Algeria. And at that point, what happens next is the United States comes in. We really haven't done anything much in basically the European theater in World War II. But 1942, the United States launches what they call Operation Torch. That's where American forces started landing with some like the British and so on into what is French North Africa, because the Vichy French still control like Morocco and Algeria at that point. And so we land forces there under really, there's several generals that Operation Torch took place with, of course, the Americans. You had like really, there was like three generals, but the top general was Dwight Eisenhower, what they call Ike later, of course, famous, president of the United States in the 1950s. Eisenhower, who later led D-Day, is the one that led the Allied forces into, at first, I guess, into Morocco, and then of course they later helped also take Algeria as well. George Patton, you may have heard of him, Old Blood and Guts, was also involved in North Africa as well in some of the campaigns. And also Omar Bradley. A lot of these are generals that will later fight, of course, in Europe against the Germans. And so at first the Vichy French actually fired on them, but they eventually decided to switch sides at that point. And they realized that the Axis powers were kind of losing the war. And so by 1943, pretty much the Germans, their forces get surrounded in what is Tunisia, to the east of Algeria. And so you got the British coming in from the east and the Americans coming in from the west with the British. And so about 300,000 German Italians eventually are basically captured. So that's kind of a major blow to Hitler's attempt to take over North Africa at that point. And Rommel escaped, though. Rommel escaped back to, of course, Germany in Europe. And I think after that, I think Hitler puts him in control of like building the so-called Atlantic Wall, which was that famous fortification that they used to try to stop the Allied invasion, especially in France. Now, the other big battle, of course, I wanted to talk about, which is very important, of course, is the Battle of Stalingrad. I guess, of course, you see here, famous image of Stalingrad right there with the background. Fought, you can see August 1942 to February of 1943. Stalingrad is really considered to be probably the most pivotal battle of World War II. I think they consider that one the biggest turning point, really, of the war. I think without the Soviets in the war, I think, I don't think the Allies would have been able to beat Germany. That's something I really believe for sure. And Stalingrad didn't start out that way. If you study about what happened in 1942, Hitler attempted another offensive after Operation Barbarossa failed. Remember, they tried to take Moscow 1942. That didn't work out. So Hitler has this other operation that they call Case Blue or Plan Blue. It was called, which was actually an offensive to actually take control of the southwestern part of Russia. Why did they want to do that? The Germans believed that that area was vital because of oil fields, like all the different oil fields in the Caucasus, in the southwestern part of Russia. So they wanted that to control that. Hitler also wanted Stalingrad and the Volga River, which is a vital river that's in the western part of Russia, Ukraine. And then Stalingrad I think was also an industrialized city, and I think a lot of people talk about the fact that maybe he should have attacked Moscow instead, or maybe Leningrad, but Stalin had most of his forces up north, and so the Soviets were weaker in the south, and that's why they attacked there. It was kind of actually the right thing to do, believe it or not. Now, what happened in the Battle of Stalingrad, you can see right here, the Germans took it. That's the thing that's funny about it. They did take the city. However, it became like a kind of an urbanized battle with fierce, close quarters combat, and also a combination of air raid. Stalingrad is very famous for high casualty rates in the war. I think somewhere between 1 to 2 million people were killed in the Battle of Stalingrad, a period of like 6 months, which that includes, I think, also civilians that were killed as well, because the Germans did a lot of air raids on Stalingrad that killed a lot of people as well. So it is considered one of the bloodiest conflicts really in human history ever. I think before that, you got to go back to maybe World War I and some other battles that happened before that. You can see most of the city was destroyed in the actual battle. And what happened was over the winter of 1942-43, the Soviets decided to counterattack the German taking of Stalingrad, and this was called Operation Uranus, is what it was called. And what happened was the main army that was in control of Stalingrad, which was the German Sixth Army, it actually got encircled when the Soviets broke through, which they say it was mostly caused by the fact that the Germans were relying on foreign troops, like mostly Romanian troops. And that's where the Soviets broke through, where the Romanian forces were. And with that, they were able to kind of encircle the main German armies that were basically occupying Stalingrad at that time. And so I think the Germans tried to get them out with a counteroffensive, I think, try to break through and get them back. But that eventually failed. And what happened was the main commander of the forces of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad eventually surrendered, which was Field Marshal Frederick Paulus, who, by the way, was the only German field marshal to actually surrender and be captured during the war. It's amazing. So almost like not quite 300,000 men, but pretty sizable army is actually captured by the Soviets. And so you can understand why Stalingrad was such a major turning point, of course, in the war. So after that, the Germans, they start backing up. They start losing territory after Stalingrad. A lot of people think Stalingrad was really the turning point of the whole war when the Germans started losing World War II. So now I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about what happened also besides 1942. I'll kind of move on to 1943 and discuss some of the major things that happened. Now, one thing that happened in 1943 was that the Allies in Europe, mostly American, British, and other uh, allies in the war, eventually invaded what is Italy. Italy was this idea of Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain. He felt like Italy was the weak spot in the West, and that what they could do is, attack Italy, seize that, go up the peninsula of Italy, and then attack Nazi Germany from the south, like through Austria, basically. They kind of thought that was the soft underbelly, of Nazi Germany, which proved to be actually not right. They find out later that it's a lot harder than they think, because the terrain, of Italy, which is pretty difficult. And so what happened was from like North Africa, they hopped from North Africa to basically to Sicily. And so in July of 1943, American and British forces, mostly led by Patton and Montgomery, invaded Sicily. And Sicily fell within I think, less than a month. And so Italian and Germans tried to put up a fight. They realized they were outnumbered. And so they retreated back to the Italian mainland. But when that happened, though, in Italy, fascist Italy at that point, what occurred was that Mussolini, at this point, because of the fact they get defeated like that, is forced to resign. So he basically steps down as prime minister, and actually the king of Italy, King Victor Emmanuel, I think the third, I believe it was, took over the actual state of Italy, and they basically ended fascism at that point. So Italy wasn't a fascist state anymore. Italy is actually, in a few months later, is going to actually join the Allied side. They'll switch over to the Allies. I want to say in October is when it is, of 1943. And of course they do imprison Mussolini. He's put in prison, but Hitler wants to get him out, if you know about this. And so later in that year, Hitler does this daring raid where he sends in some SS commandos to basically save Mussolini. And so that's what happened. It's called the Grand Sasso Raid, I think is what they called it. And this man named Otto Skorzeny, you may have heard of him. He was a famous Waffen SS commander, famous for a scar there on his face, you can see. He actually is the one behind it. He helps to basically get him out at that point. And Hitler puts Mussolini in control as a dictator in the north. He's actually ahead of this actual state called the Italian Social Republic, which he rules from 1943 to 45. It's like really a German puppet state. But he'll kind of be in control of it as the Allies are trying to take the Italian peninsula at that point. But he's later captured at the end of the war. If you know about what happened to Mussolini later, he gets captured at the end of the war. He's later killed by partisans. Now, Italy was kind of a tough conflict. They sometimes call it the so-called Forgotten War. But what happened was after the Italians switched to the Allied side, which they did, a lot of people thought that the Germans would just retreat from the Italian peninsula because Italy's been knocked out of the war at that point. But Hitler decided he was going to continue the war and fight alone. And so practically Italy's, like the areas that the Germans control, pretty much becomes like a puppet state with them there. And so it starts the so-called Italian campaign, which will last until 1945. And the Italian campaign was kind of a different kind of conflict because of they were kind of preparing for D-Day in Europe. They brought in a lot of different nationalities that fought actually in the Italian campaign. People from all over the world. I think India, as far away as India, they sent people to fight really in the war. With Americans, they had actually had African Americans that were fighting in Italy in some units. They had also the famous Nasi, or the Japanese Americans. That's when they fought mostly, was in Italy, which is kind of famous. And the Allies fought against this actually Luftwaffe general, believe it or not, named Albert Kesselring, who they called, by the way, Smiling Albert, who you can see here on this picture right here on the left, because famous for a smile, I guess, there. And Kesselring used the terrain of Italy, like the mountains and the hills, to slow down the advance of the Allies up the peninsula. And so it took them months to basically take Italy. But eventually by June 4th, actually June 5th, 1944, you can see Rome basically falls. And Rome, by the way, was one of the first Axis capitals to really fall, of course, in the war. There were some famous battles in Italy. I don't need to talk as much into those, but yeah, the battles of Anzio was very famous, which I think was an amphibious battle which the Americans were involved in. And Monte Cassino, which was a very strategic battle for the taking of Rome, 1944. It was probably the bloodiest battle that was fought really in the Italian campaign, which I think the Allies took heavy casualties, more than the Axis, in trying to take it. But those are some of the pivotal battles that were fought really in 1944 in Italy. But it's kind of sometimes called the so-called forgotten war, because of, the fact that they kind of move on to D-Day at that point. So that's the next thing, of course, I want to get into today, is talk about D-Day, which, of course, 1944, the Allies decided, in the West that they were going to open up this other front against, Nazi Germany. Of course, later called the D-Day invasion, often called Operation Overlord, but oftentimes just simply called D-Day. The Allies, of course, had been preparing for this invasion for months, like in, I know, America, I know in Britain and other places. And the idea was to basically get back occupied, France, which the Germans had held for just about 4 years, that they'd be in control of it. And the D-Day invasion, by the way, involved multiple nationalities. The United States put up a majority of the forces, like close to about 60% or more. Britain put up forces, so did Canada, believe it or not. The Free French and the Free Polish forces also put up forces. And the initial invasion was supposed to be on June 5th, but because of weather, they invaded on June 6th. Dwight Eisenhower, who I told you was Ike, later president of the United States, he's one that commands, of course, the Allied Expeditionary Force that will invade northern France. And of course, if you know about D-Day, D-Day was one of the largest invasions in history, especially in amphibious invasion history. And kind of shows some images of D-Day. But D-Day itself, if you study about it, it involved, at least on the initial invasion, about 160 to about 170,000 troops. That's about the initial amount that invaded on the first day, which is June 6th. Involved over 6,000 naval ships were involved in D-Day, and then about 11,000 or more aircraft was also involved. So quite a massive operation, of course, that occurred. And, if you know much about D-Day, one of the main things that's kind of pivotal I want to mention about that's important. There was a man named Andrew Higgins, you may have heard of, who was known for his landing craft that was used in the war. I think Hitler had called him the so-called New Noah. And he developed a lot of the landing craft that was used in a lot of these amphibious operations, not just in Europe or whatever, North Africa, but also in the Pacific. They're often called so-called Higgins boats. And a lot of these types of vessels were originally used for Louisiana, like swamps, and marshes, things like that we know about here in Louisiana. And he's a very famous native of New Orleans, of course, Andrew Higgins. So I think without him, the Allies might not have won the war either, as well. Right. Let me also talk about, of course, there's the so-called Higgins boat right there. But let me talk about one thing that's very famous about D-Day that most people don't know about. And it was a thing called Operation Bodyguard that was very vital with the invasion of France. And this was a deception plan that the Allies put into motion to fool the Germans on the location of where the invasion would come. I think they wanted to make sure that the Germans thought that the invasion would come out Calais, the pass of Calais between where the Strait of Dover is, which is like really closer between England and France. And include like deception, which was involving like fake landing locations, fake invasion armies. They had even like double agents that were out there giving bogus information to the Germans. And one of the most famous was called Quicksilver. Quicksilver was this operation where they had a fake invasion forces that were put near where Dover is, Dover, England, across where the pass to Calais is. And they had bogus armies such as the 1st U.S. Army Group, which was headed up by Patton, George S. Patton. And they used all kinds of fake in tactics like inflatable tanks, inflatable airplanes, and fake airplanes, bombers, fake ships, and things like that to really fool people and stuff like that. It was also sometimes called Fortitude South was another name they called Quicksilver as well. They also had like Fortitude North, which was a fake invasion of Norway. They even had Operation Zeppelin, which was fake invasions of southern Europe, like Greece and other places, and things like that. So all that kind of was important in why the Allies were able to win D-Day, I guess, in the end. Of course, with D-Day, which happened on, like I said, June 6, 1944, all the different Allied forces involved with that landed on various beach sectors. So you can see that the Americans landed on what are like Omaha and Utah, which Omaha was really the bloodiest, I think, of the invasion beaches that they came ashore on, which you can see right there. 1st Division, Utah, 4th Division, of course, Omaha, U.S. Army. Then, of course, you can see the British, of course, landed on Gold and Sword beaches. And then you can see the Canadians came ashore on Juneau beach sector as well. So those are all different ones, of course, they were involved in landing. You can see they also used airborne divisions as well, 82nd Airborne. And then you can see looks like the British had the 6th Airborne Division as well. So yeah, that was really I think like something like 9,000 were killed on the first day when they came in. But from there, they're going to be able to push inward and begin taking over Normandy. And so that leads into what they call the Battle of Normandy, of course, which follows after that. The Battle of Normandy was really the most pivotal battle, really, of the D-Day invasion. Which the whole thing is Operation Neptune, I think, is the actual invasion itself that they called it, because Overlord was just the plans of it and all of that. And so from there, they start taking cities like Cherbourg and Caen, right there. And the idea was to drive on Paris, take Paris, and then Allied forces would also drive up with the southern part of France as well and force the Germans to retreat back into Belgium and Germany. One of the pivotal battles that was fought was the Battle of Falaise Pocket, or Falaise Gap, it was called, which was fought August 1944. Hitler tried to counterattack the actual D-Day invasion, and most of his forces got almost destroyed or encircled in the battle, but some of his armies escaped at that point. And so with the Allies invading from the north, northern France, and also southern France as well, the Germans were forced to eventually basically give up Paris. They start retreating back towards Belgium and Germany. And so, yeah, the Battle of Normandy is important. It led to the fall of Paris, which later falls a few days later. August 24th, 25th is when basically the Allies, of course, march into Paris. Normandy was one of our bloodiest conflicts we were in. 226,000 men, by the way, were the casualties that were fought in that conflict overall. I think more men died in Normandy than any other battle, of course, in the war. I think after that, it's the Battle of Bulge, which is also pretty bloody as well. Now, I want to talk about another incident that happened too at the end of the war, which is kind of famous, you may have heard about. Well, 1944 in July, there was an attempt by German officers in the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, to overthrow Hitler, which was called different names. 20 July plot is one of the nicknames for it because that's when it happened on July 20th of 1944. They also call it Operation Valkyrie. I think the Gestapo had another name, which was called the Schwarzkapelle, which means Black Orchestra. And anyway, it was a ring of German officers that were in the Wehrmacht that tried to overthrow Hitler. They think they were trying to kill him off and then take over control of the war. Now, whether they wanted to sue for peace early, they don't really know for sure about that. But it went all the way up to like officers like they had this one guy named Cardinal. You may have heard of Admiral Canaris, who was in the Abwehr, which was the German armed forces intelligence branch. He was kind of involved in it. But one of the guys they always talk about is Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. He was one of the men that was kind of involved as a chief conspirator. And he was the one that was sent as the assassin to try to kill, of course, Hitler. And he went to Hitler's main headquarters, like military headquarters in East Prussia called the Wolf's Lair, a place called Rastenburg, to go there for a meeting. And he brought 2 bombs in a briefcase. And he was able to arm one of the bombs, but not the other, because I don't know if you know about Stauffenberg. He had been injured in the war in North Africa and lost one hand. I think on his other hand, he only had 2 or 3 fingers. Was kind of using pliers to try to arm them. He was only able to arm one of the 2 bombs. And when the bomb went off, it didn't kill Hitler. It killed maybe a couple people in the meeting, but I think if he would have got the other bomb armed, he probably would have been able to kill basically Hitler. But it fails. Hitler survives, of course, the plot. And a lot of the conspirators were eventually, a bunch of them were arrested. I think Stauffenberg was shot, of course, for being involved in it. And so the plot to kill Hitler didn't work. Of course, Erwin Rommel ended up being implicated in it, by the way. He was forced to commit suicide. It was one thing that kind of came out of it. So we are getting close to the end of the war. Now, the end of the war, I kind of talk about a few things that happened that are kind of famous. One big thing that was, of course, that occurred at the end of World War II, you may have heard about, is the Battle of the Bulge. That was really one of our most famous battles that the United States fought in, especially mostly by ourselves. The Battle of the Bulge took place between December 1944 to January 1945, about 5-6 weeks in the winter, which was a pretty severe battle. And Bulge was called different nicknames. Sometimes it's called the Battle of the Ardennes, because they had one in 1940, they had before, but this one, of course, happened in 1944-45. And the Germans called it Operation Watch on the River Rhine. And the Germans wanted to counterattack the Allies in the West because they were hoping to defeat them so they could face the Soviets in the East. And the Germans at that point had been pushed back all the way into Belgium. If you look at this map I've got right here, you can see how, quickly as Paris fell, like around August 1944, you can see how the Allies start pushing back the Germans towards into Belgium, into France by September. So that quickly they were able to push them back. And so this whole operation was an attempt to basically do that. Also, the Allies had taken Antwerp, which is in Belgium, which was a very important seaport where the Allies could supply, the Germans against the Germans, to fight them. And so Hitler wanted to retake Antwerp, basically, and cut their supply lines, which could have also changed the whole course of the war in the West at that point. But and why do they call it Battle of the Bulge? It was called that because when the Germans pushed westward into the Allied lines, it created this huge bulge in their lines, which you can kind of see on this image here. So at one point, the Germans pushed the Allied lines this far back into like Belgium and part of France. And it looked like they were going to break through. However, the Germans couldn't take the whole pocket. There was this one major town in Belgium called Baton, where the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, were holding out against the Germans. And there was this famous American general named Anthony McAuliffe. He refused to surrender to the Germans. And when they sent him a message to surrender, McAuliffe was very famous for sending back a message that said simply "nuts," that we're not going to surrender. And I think I called him later Anthony Nuts McAuliffe was, of course, his name. Later, Patton's forces under what is the Patton's Third Army, they'll help to kind of seal the Bulge. But by January of 1945, the Battle of the Bulge actually fails. The Germans are unable to break through at that point. And from there, what ends up happening, Nazi Germany is then invaded by multiple powers. You got the Soviets, invading from the east. That's something that happens. They'll eventually take Berlin by May of 1945. You got that going on. And then from the west, you got Britain, the United States, the French forces, etc. They cross the Rhine River also as well. So both those are events that are kind of going on in 1945. And so, yeah, pretty much you can see here a map showing you what happens to Nazi Germany. They get invaded from multiple sides. So you got the Allies coming up through Italy, Allies coming in, from the west, through Belgium, Germany, into from France. Of course, the Soviets invaded through Poland, up through Hungary, Yugoslavia, into Germany. And so eventually what ends up happening, the Battle of Berlin was really considered the last major battle of World War II in Europe. It took place, you see, April 16th to May of 1945. And eventually the Germans are forced to surrender. They start surrendering on May 8th, 1945. Later that's known as VE Day, of course, so-called Victory in Europe Day. What happened to Hitler? Well, they think Hitler, at least as far as they know, committed suicide. I know there's rumors that he escaped, or I think the other was that he died fighting against the Soviet forces in Berlin. I think they still kind of speculate what happened to him, but they think Hitler likely killed himself and didn't want to be captured. And so that pretty much ended the war. And so the war in Europe was, like I said, pretty much over with the Nazis, of course, surrendering. But of course, we'll get to it later. Europe is kind of different after World War II. You've got the Cold War era that'll start up. Because the United States and the Soviets are really the last two major superpowers, that you got left. Now, I want to move on. I want to talk about a little bit today about the Pacific Campaign, which was another major event that also happened, in World War II, where the United States, of course, fought Japan. We fought them from Pearl Harbor, up to the end of the war in 1945. So we kind of fought to kind of reverse what happened at Pearl, because we suffered, a major defeat there in December 1941. Now, one of the major events that they talk about, of course, that's pretty important, I'll get to today, is the Battle of Midway. And that particular battle, if you know much about the Pacific Campaign or Pacific War in World War II, that one was considered the turning point war for us, against Japan in the Pacific, because up to that point, the Japanese were doing pretty good in the war. They had actually taken control of parts of the Western Pacific. And in that battle, our naval forces, which were kind of outnumbered, if you study about it, in fact, they had more aircraft carriers than we did. I think they had 4 and we had 3, I know of. Anyway, the U.S. fleet would end up sinking 4 main fleet carriers of the Japanese, the Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu, which were, by the way, 4 of the 6 aircraft carriers that were used to attack Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. So we were able to kind of take revenge on the Japanese. And so, yeah, June 4th to 7th, I think is usually the dates of basically that. and we mostly used dive bombers, of course, to attack their carriers. And so Midway was considered a miracle. It was considered like a turning point, in the war. I think we only ended up losing one aircraft carrier, which was the USS Yorktown, that was hit by dive bombers. And then also, I think it was also hit by torpedoes from a Japanese submarine as well. I think you can see it here kind of listing before it sank, the USS Yorktown. But after Midway, the United States starts, going on the offensive after the war. We kind of start this new real strategy in the war, which they often call it island hopping, or some people call it leapfrogging as well. And so we have the strategy of taking back island by island, using the U.S. Navy with the Marines, and also the Army. U.S. Army forces are also involved. So kind of a coordination between all those three branches of the American military were kind of used. And we didn't take all islands back. We kind of just bypassed some islands and left some Japanese on there. I think there was even some case where some Japanese didn't know the war was over for years because we just bypassed them or whatever. Yeah, they had different strategies. Like Chester Nimitz, if you know about him, he was the head of the Pacific Fleet, main admiral, and they wanted to mostly attack through the Central Pacific. Was what he wanted to do, Nimitz. And then Douglas MacArthur, who was in the U.S. Army, he was the main top general in the Pacific in the war. He wanted to attack the Southern Pacific because if you know about Douglas MacArthur, he wanted to get back the Philippines, which he had lost in 1941. And so that's basically what the whole plan was. And so one of the first things that the United States did, of course, in World War II was we took back the Solomon Islands chain, which is like right above Australia. And anyway, Solomon Islands were important. I think Japan was going to use that area and also New Guinea to maybe take over Australia, believe it or not. Yeah. So U.S. Marines were brought in primarily to take back the important island of Guadalcanal, the Solomons, because the Japanese were basically building a lot of airfields in that area to try to, attack certain parts of that area, like New Guinea and Australia, etc. And that particular battle is very important in Guadalcanal. It's considered really the first major battle that the Marine Corps really fights in the war. And it was almost like a fight to the death because they find out that the Japanese are very tenacious. They had about 36,000 troops on the island, and about 24,000 practically fought to the death, trying to hold on to it. And the Japanese, realizing it was hopeless, eventually evacuated their forces using their navy. So Guadalcanal was very difficult. They kind of were fighting in horrible conditions, like swamp, jungle kind of conditions, and so on. But it's definitely considered like one of our first major land victories that we have in the war. After that, the other thing we took back next, we took the Gilbert Islands next in 1943, with the most important battle being the Battle of Tarawa. That was a pretty bloody Marine battle that was fought as well. November of 1943. So you can see there in the central part of the map on the bottom, Tarawa. However, in 1944, the islands that were really the most strategic that were retaken, not the Philippines, which I think MacArthur thought was important. Actually, the ones that would be more important than anything would be the Mariana Islands. Those were very important because the Americans are going to use those to take those islands and then build bomber bases on there where they could then bomb the Japanese from the air, which they mostly use B-29s to bomb them. And so that took a few months, but June to November of 1944, so-called Operation Forger, they sometimes nickname it, the American forces landed on the Mariana Islands, and we took back the main islands of Guam, Tinian, and also Saipan. So all those islands will be retaken and will be, like I said, strategic later. We do take back the Philippines as well. That'll be in 1944. They have the so-called Battle of the Philippines, where it's called all kinds of names. I think that particular conflict, that was a pretty bloody conflict as well. The Philippines, it's got a bunch of naval battles: Battle of the Philippine Sea, Battle of Lady Gulf, I think was another famous battle associated with also that in the Pacific War. They talk about that battle sometimes, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They consider that one to be one of the most famous naval battles of the war because it was the fact it was the largest naval battle fought in history, where I think both sides combined had over 300 ships involved. I think we had like close to 300 or more naval ships. We had like multiple aircraft carriers, of course, involved in that battle. Was pretty important because we eventually wiped out most of the Japanese Navy by the end of that battle. So those are kind of pivotal battles that were kind of important in the war and all that. This is a very kind of an iconic photo, by the way, I did want to show you, which is the one that MacArthur's is wading ashore the Philippines when they took back the Philippines. Most people don't know about it, but it's a staged picture. Because I think when they landed in the Philippines, MacArthur realized that they forgot to film himself, coming ashore, so he went back and just staged it. That's kind of funny. But anyway, one thing that's very famous also about 1944, I did want to mention about, like when you get to battles like Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and battles like that, one thing that the Japanese started doing at the end of the war, I think Leyte Gulf was one of the first battles where the Japanese started using kamikaze suicide planes, if you know about that, which kamikaze supposedly means divine wind in Japanese. And so they got real desperate. They started like putting bombs or whatever on planes and trying to, basically blow up, ships or whatever, and kill sailors. And between 1944-45, the Japanese sunk at least 34 ships and damaged, you can see 368 involved in the so-called kamikaze attacks. And now in Baton Rouge, they have the famous USS Kidd that we have in this city, Baton Rouge, and it was hit by a kamikaze, by the way, plane, I know, during the war. But like close to 9,000 sailors were killed and wounded in a lot of these attacks, but a lot of them were kind of desperate. The Japanese would end up, not winning the war. Most of their navy, pretty much by that time was just about wiped out. There were some other battles, of course, later that are kind of more famous, I think, in World War II. Of course, Iwo Jima, if you know about World War II, it's really considered one of the most famous battles that the U.S. Marines were involved in the war. Often called Operation Detachment. The Marines, of course, are famous for taking the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, famous for its black sand. And as you know, the Iwo Jima battle is famous for being, part of the now Marine Corps hymn that everybody's kind of heard before. And Iwo Jima, why did the Americans want to take it? Well, it was an important island because it was kind of east of Japan in the so-called, or near the so-called Bonin Islands. And the Americans were going to use Iwo Jima as like a naval base, but also as also like a bomber base as well for any kind of bombers that were coming back from Japan that might need to refuel or they're damaged or whatever. They could stop off there, of course. And so that's why they took it. And Iwo Jima was seized with a lot of heavy casualties. Like the Marines suffered like something like 26,000 killed or wounded in the battle. And the Japanese, who had like 19,000 men, fought to almost to the death. They refused to surrender. And so they practically had to go and just kill them all because, like I said, the Japanese believe in that so-called code of Bushido, where they don't believe in surrendering to an enemy. And so they say only 200 men of the Japanese on Iwo Jima actually surrendered, which is famous. Of course, one of the most iconic things that happened, if you know about Iwo Jima, was the famous raising of the American flag on Mount Suribachi. It's really considered the most iconic photograph ever taken, I think, in World War II, at least on the American side in the war. It was taken by the AP photographer named Joe Rosenthal. It shows 6 Marines lifting the flag, of course, on Mount Suribachi, which was like a dormant volcano on the island. And most people don't know about of the 6 men that raised the flag. 3 of the men died in the battle. They didn't make it. It was actually an Indian named Ira Hayes, who was one of the 6 men that was kind of famous for being one of the flag raisers that did that. So yeah, Iwo Jima. Then they also have, of course, another famous battle, which is Okinawa, that they had as well, which really is our last major battle that we have in the Pacific that's well known. Yeah, March to June 1945, the Americans seized Okinawa. Okinawa was one of Japan's home islands. It's kind of south of Japan. The Americans wanted to take that island because we were thinking of next invading Japan and trying to take it, which later the Americans called that Operation Downfall. But we never got to that, luckily, because I think they say if we would have invaded Japan or had to, it would have been really high casualties, more than all these other battles that we fought in the Pacific. And so it was actually nicknamed Operation Iceberg, is what it was called. Involved actually U.S. Army forces and Marines. It was the bloodiest, by the way, and largest amphibious invasion in the Pacific that we had. And yeah, the casualties were pretty high. Like the U.S. forces suffered close to 60 to 70,000 men. 13,000 or almost 13,000 were killed in the battle. So yeah, that was really our bloodiest battle that we fought in the Pacific overall. Japanese, by the way, just like Iwo Jima, they refused to surrender a lot of their forces. 110,000 were killed. Yeah, seriously. 11,000 surrendered. So like, I think I want to say like maybe 10% of their force survived that was left of it at that point. So that's Okinawa. And so, yeah, at this point, where it looks like we're going to drive on Japan and take it. And of course, like I said, some think we're going to have to invade, Japan and all that. But the United States had been working on a famous, very secret project in the war, which was the so-called Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was this secret military army project to build a super bomb or super weapon, which would be the so-called atomic bomb, which we were, by the way, going to use it on Germany, was the plan. However, that war ended, if you know about it, and so it got used on Japan instead. They think the Manhattan Project was started by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1943. They think it actually was the brainchild of Albert Einstein, who had escaped Nazi Germany to the West. And the Manhattan Project, by the way, was led by different men. There was a man named Leslie Groves, who was the top Army general, who was actually in the Army Corps of Engineers. He was an engineer. He was the one that actually ran the Manhattan Project, which, by the way, was very secretive. Very few people knew what they were working on with this project. Like when they tell what they were building, they would say, we're building the gadget. They didn't want to tell them what it was specifically. And so Los Alamos, New Mexico would be the actual headquarters of where the Manhattan Project would be and where they would actually build the actual bombs. They called it Manhattan Project because some early experiments were done at the Columbia University, Manhattan, New York, and all that. Groves was famous, by the way, for building the Pentagon building. I don't know if you know about that, but he was the engineer that designed and built it and all that. And the Pentagon building, is basically the main headquarters of the U.S. Defense Department, of course, today. Also, I did want to mention about, of course, one of the most famous men associated with, of course, the Manhattan Project, which was J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was an American physicist at the University of California at Berkeley, and he was the one that actually designed and built the bombs. They often call him the so-called father of the atomic bomb, which is kind of a terrible nickname to have. That's not what they call him. And Oppenheimer had realized that this bomb could really destroy the world, but obviously could be used, in the war and all that. And so eventually they built like two main bombs. Actually, they built three bombs, which the two main ones they'll build later, the ones they'll drop on Japan, will be Fat Man, which you see in the background there, and the one in front, which of course is called Little Boy. Both these are so-called fission bombs that they would construct. And Little Boy was a uranium bomb that they built first, and then Fat Man was a plutonium bomb that they built as well. And they had another bomb. They built two, which I told you they call it the Gadget. That one was actually uh, exploded on July 16th, 1945, in what the Americans called the so-called Trinity test, which was done near Alamogordo, New Mexico, and it was successfully tested. It did blow up into a huge mushroom cloud like atomic bombs do, and all of that. And they realized that they had this new kind of super weapon that they could use, of course, against Japan, because Germany was at that point knocked out of the war. Both bombs were eventually shipped across the Pacific, both the Little Boy and Fat Man. They'll be sent to the island of Tinian in the Marianas Islands, where B-29s will then bring these bombs to attack, of course, the Japanese. And so, of course, the next thing that happened is you get, of course, the famous Enola Gay. I'll kind of talk about that particular plane, which is well known. Little Boy, the first bomb I talked about that will be dropped on Japan on August 6th, 1945. The Enola Gay is probably considered to be one of the most famous, really, warplanes of World War II. It's a so-called B-29 Super Fortress, which these were new kinds of bombers, by the way, that would be first used in the atomic era. You actually hear atomic bombs and things like that. And it was piloted by this man named Paul Tibbets. He was kind of famous in the end of World War II. That's Paul Tibbets, who basically captained the famous Enola Gay and his crew. I always loved the shorts, by the way. That's the way shorts used to be in the old days. Anyway, the bomb dropped on Japan, of course. You can see that's the actual picture that they took when they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And the bomb, they say, killed like close to 100,000 people when it blew up, destroying several square miles of Hiroshima. A lot of people died of radiation poisoning, but believe it or not, the Americans killed more people really from firebombing Japan. Because I don't know if you heard of General Curtis LeMay of the U.S. Army Air Force. They started using napalm. You know about that, bombing Japan with napalm bombs. That probably killed more people than the atomic bombs did. But the bombing of Japan is one of the main things that really helped to really end World War II. Later, there was a second bomb that they dropped too, which was the second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped eventually on Nagasaki, which is a city south of Hiroshima on the bottom of Japan. It was dropped on August 9th by the B-29 Boxcar, and it killed, I think, close to 80,000 people as well. And you can see here some pictures of Hiroshima as an example, all the destruction that went with these atomic bombs. You can see that's in black and white, but you can see this color picture kind of shows you a better picture of basically how devastating these atomic weapons could be. Pretty much any kind of small buildings or whatever were all totally destroyed. You can see the only thing really standing are major kind of buildings that are much larger that weren't quite totally destroyed. Because of all this, the Japanese are eventually going to start surrendering. They on August 15th, of course, first, if you know about this, the Japanese began surrendering their forces to the Allies in Asia, in the Pacific, and so-called VE Day. It should be VJ Day. That's spelled wrong. VJ Day, which of course is known as Victory over Japan Day. And so at that point, the Japanese, realized the war is over at that point, and so they began. That's what they call it. That's what we call it in the United States, victory over Japan Day. But yeah, the Japanese don't officially surrender until September 2nd, 1945. They actually, on the USS Missouri, which is a famous battleship in Tokyo Bay, the Japanese came and then signed the official, orders to really end the war at that point. And so, yeah, the war lasted 6 years because remember, the war started in September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded, Poland and all that. So, yeah, it's almost 6 years of the day, maybe 6 years one day, we'll put it that way. So, 60 million people, they say, died at the most in World War II. So, World War II was a devastating war. If you know about World War II, the Allies in Europe discovered that the Germans had committed war atrocities, not just against Jews, but other peoples, of course, in the war. And of course, the Holocaust, is one of the most famous events that happened. They say in World War II, the so-called Shoah, where Nazi Germany committed mass genocide against European Jews and other peoples that they killed in the war. And this was all part of a plan, they say, that the Germans devised in January of 1942. They say that the actual Holocaust started in the 1930s. You can go back to the so-called Nuremberg Laws, 1935, Kristallnacht, 1938. But they say systematically, they say the Germans really put it on a war footing in January of 1942 with the so-called Wannsee Conference, which was held in a suburb of Berlin. They decided the so-called final solution to the Jewish question, which was to basically either use the Jews as slave labor or to try to eliminate them, kill them all. And not just Jews, but Nazi Germany, killed, they say anybody that was, against them, Poles, Soviets, civilians, any kind of Soviet, a lot of Soviet troops were killed in the war. I forget how many Soviet POWs died under them. It was like 2-3 million in the war. Roma, or we call the Gypsies, you may have heard of them in Europe. A lot of them were singled out as well. Handicapped as well. Political, religious, like certain kind of priests, rabbis, people like that were killed as well. Gays or homosexuals were killed as well. And they think somewhere between 5 to 6 million Jews may have been killed also in the war. They think that the Germans shipped basically Jews and other peoples to Auschwitz and other famous death camps, in the war. As you know, Auschwitz was one of the most famous, of course. They had Auschwitz, Belzec, Sobibor, Matodik, Treblinka, Chelmno. Those were famous different kinds of death camps, which a lot of the main ones were in Poland that they put there. But Auschwitz, I think, was the most notorious, as you know, which was a combination of concentration and death camp that was there. So you had that going on. And of course, they used the railroads to ship a lot of these people. And so that's why Adolf Eichmann, if you know about that, after the war was they kind of sought him after the war, especially Israel, because he was kind of instrumental in rounding up the Jews and eventually sending to all these camps, etc. So they won't really find out about this until really the Nuremberg trials that, of course, come in afterwards, which are also very famous as well. At the end of the war, you have that too. You got, the war crimes trials that they hold in Bavaria, in the southern part of Germany. And so the Nazi regime, you have a lot of the high-ranking members were put on trial for war crimes and being involved in the Holocaust. And some of that included like men under Hitler, also included some of the generals and admirals that were under Hitler. A lot of them were eventually imprisoned. And you see there, the one that was the most famous and notorious that they put on trial was Hermann Goering. You see right here. He had been the head of the Luftwaffe. He was, I think, involved in developing some of those camps we talked about, they believe. But he was found guilty really only about 10, I think, Nazis were actually executed, and the rest were all in prison and all that. But they did the same thing in Japan too. Like Tojo, I told you about, one of their prime ministers was eventually put on trial. He was executed as well. They did execute Emperor Hirohito, which was kind of surprising as well. They kind of decided to spare him, if you know about that. But like I said, World War II was a very bloody conflict. If you look at here, you can see how the amount of deaths, Soviet Union had the most, which they say Soviet Union, like something like 20 million or more people killed in the war. After that, it was China. China had the second most deaths in the war, which included a combination of, well, it was civilian deaths, and China died, about that in that war as well. After that's Germany had a pretty good amount. They were killed in the war. I think theirs was like 5-6 million that died in the war overall. Japan had a pretty good amount too, you can see. But Poland, you can see Poland there. Notice that Poland had a lot of deaths too, which was a combination of Jews and Poles. They were killed, of course, in the war. So United States, we didn't really have that many people killed in the war. I think we were like 400-something thousand were killed, of course, in this war. Both my uncles served, of course, in World War II. They were in the Navy and all that. So anyway, that pretty much concludes, of course, the history of World War II. Very bloody conflict. Of course, I will be getting in later into the week. I'll talk about how, World War II helps to, create basically what is the Cold War era. It'll follow in late 40s, goes up to like the early 1990s. After the war, United States, Soviet Union are really the only two major superpowers that you got left. And so you end up with this geopolitical conflict that occurs, which almost causes World War III, of course, to break out. So that's kind of an issue, of course, that we have. So looks like we had a few other students, I think, were present as well. I didn't get to. So it's like Trevor looks like was there. I don't know if I got you or not this morning. Tawana, Courtney, Kaylee, Spence. I think y'all, of course, had also been involved. I think there earlier I saw that as well. But anyway, yeah, I did want to talk about a few things, of course, about the end of the semester. Of course, I will be posting, like I said, the final exam, which that'll be on, like I said, the rise of fascism in Europe and also World War II. So that's going to be pretty much my final. So I'll go ahead and post this week, post it early because that won't be really due until like early December, but kind of give some time on that to work on that. But of course, not all of you will be able to have to take it. Those that are exempt, 96% or higher, of course, will be exempt from taking the final. But you will, of course, have to, wrap up your assignment. So vocab, book report, those kind of things, need to be wrapped up at the end of the semester so you can maintain that percentage and all that. Also, later in the week, I'll have another quiz coming up, which will be for bonus points on the Cold War era. I'm going to have a bonus quiz for extra credit on that. And any student can, of course, take that. So even if you're exempt and all that. So I just want to remind you, of course, like I said, about various assignments that are out there before I go. But these are pretty much, besides the book report that y'all have got, looks like I've got pretty much the second exam. That's still open right now. I'll probably give you a few more days to kind of wrap that up, even though we got the final coming up. War One quiz, don't forget about that. If you haven't turned your third vocab in, get that into me. That's going to be the last one. And of course, the final exam, of course, coming up as well. But book reports will be due next weekend. Of course, don't forget about that. So that's it for today. Doesn't look like anybody has any questions, but if you have a comment later, you can always leave, of course, a comment question, of course, on my YouTube channel. So that's it for today. Y'all take care, and I'll see you later in the week, of course, to talk about, of course, the Cold War era. So y'all have a great week and all that.